The black Mustang stood perfectly still in the center of the corral, but his eyes tracked every movement like he was calculating something. Not fear, not anger, something else entirely. Callan Reese had seen that look before, in horses that had been broken the wrong way. But this was different. This horse wasn't broken at all. He was waiting. 3 professional horse trainers had walked away from this ranch in the past month, and now Callan understood why. The scars along Bronson's flanks weren't from barbed wire or rough terrain. They were too precise, too deliberate. Someone had hurt this animal on purpose, and the horse remembered every second of it. Neville Hartman wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cool morning air. I'm telling you, Callan, this horse is cursed. Martinez lasted 2 days before he packed up and left without even asking for payment. Said he'd never seen anything like it. Callan adjusted his worn leather gloves and studied the 5-year-old stallion through the metal rails. Bronson's coat gleamed like polished obsidian in the Texas sunlight, his muscles rippling beneath perfectly healthy skin. Nothing about this horse suggested illness or injury, yet every trainer who'd attempted to work with him had failed within days. What exactly happened with the last guy? Callan asked, not taking his eyes off the horse. Thompson? He was confident as hell when he arrived. Said he'd broken horses twice as wild as this one. First day went fine, just assessment and observation. Second day, he tried to approach with a halter. Neville shook his head. Horse didn't bolt, didn't rear, didn't show aggression, just stared at him. Thompson said it was like the horse was reading his mind, anticipating every move before he made it. Callan frowned. That didn't sound like typical wild horse behavior. Mustangs were flight animals. When cornered, they ran or fought. They didn't strategize. Then what? Thompson tried everything. Different approaches, different equipment, even brought in his best mare to calm him down. Nothing worked. Horse would stand there calm as Sunday morning, but the second Thompson got within 10 feet with any kind of tack, he'd position himself exactly where Thompson couldn't reach him. Not aggressive, just unreachable. Bronson's ears swiveled toward them, and for a moment, those dark eyes locked with Callan's. Intelligence burned there, along with something that made Callan's chest tighten. This wasn't defiance or wildness. This was a horse that had learned to protect himself by being smarter than the humans who wanted to control him. Thompson said it was like trying to catch smoke, Neville continued. Horse knew exactly what he was planning before he planned it. But Callan was no longer listening. He was staring at a small scar just above Bronson's left shoulder. A perfectly round mark, too clean to be accidental. His blood ran cold as recognition hit him. That wasn't a scar from training equipment. That was a cigarette burn. Callan's hands tightened on the corral rail as he studied the marks more closely. That round scar could have been from anything. A branding iron, a heated nail, even an accident with farm equipment. But something about the placement bothered him. Too precise, too deliberate. Neville, who owned this horse before you? Bought him from a livestock auction in El Paso 3 months ago. Previous owner was some rancher named Burke, had a small operation outside Marfa. Said the horse just needed more experienced hands. Callan didn't respond immediately. He was counting other marks now. Rope burns around the pasterns, a faint line across the bridge of the nose. Could be rough handling during transport, or just the reality of working with an unbroken Mustang. But the pattern bothered him. This horse isn't just wild, Neville. Look at how he positions himself. Bronson had moved again, another calculated step that kept him exactly where the morning shadows provided the most concealment while maintaining visual contact with both men. The movement was too strategic for a simple flight animal. What do you mean? Most wild horses rely on speed and panic when they feel threatened. They bolt, they rear, they fight with pure instinct. Callan studied Bronson's posture, the way he kept his weight balanced and ready. This horse is thinking. He's calculating distance, escape routes, positioning. That's not wild behavior. That's survival behavior. Neville frowned. What's the difference? Wild horses haven't learned to fear humans specifically. They're just naturally cautious around predators. Callan turned toward the house. But survival behavior means he's had reasons to develop strategies against people. Bad reasons. Bronson's ears flicked forward at the sound of Callan's voice, a subtle acknowledgement that sent a chill down the old cowboy's spine. The horse was listening to their conversation, processing their words and tone. You think Burke mistreated him? I think Burke didn't tell you the whole truth about this horse's history. Callan paused at the gate. Question is whether he was hiding incompetence or something worse. as they walked toward the house. Callan noticed Bronson tracking their movement with obvious intelligence. But what struck him most wasn't the horse's awareness. It was the way those dark eyes seemed to be evaluating him specifically, trying to determine what kind of threat he represented. After 40 years of working with horses, Callan had developed an instinct for reading their psychological state. Fear, he understood. Aggression, he could handle. But what he saw in Bronson's eyes was something that made his chest tighten. This wasn't a horse that had been broken by rough training. This was a horse that had learned to expect betrayal from every human who showed him kindness. The kind of wariness that only came from having trust weaponized against him. The question was, what exactly had Burke done to teach this beautiful animal that even compassion could be dangerous? For the next hour, Callan simply sat on the fence rail about 15 feet from Bronson, saying nothing, making no sudden movements. He didn't look directly at the horse, didn't hold any equipment, didn't even face him completely. Instead, he positioned himself at an angle, the way horses approached each other when they weren't threatening. Bronson's reaction was immediate but subtle. His breathing slowed. His ears, which had been pinned back in defensive mode, relaxed to a neutral position. After 30 minutes, he took one small step closer, not toward Callan, just closer to where Callan existed in space. "What's he doing?" Neville called softly from the porch. "Learning that I'm not going to hurt him just because I'm here." Callan kept his voice low, non-threatening. Most trainers see a difficult horse and immediately start applying pressure. But pressure is exactly what reinforces fear in an animal that's already been traumatized. "So you're just going to sit there?" For now, Callan noted that Bronson was favoring his left rear leg, just barely, almost imperceptibly. This horse needs to understand that humans can exist in his space without demanding anything from him. The next morning, Callan arrived at dawn and resumed his position. This time, Bronson was waiting for him, positioned maybe 12 feet away instead of 15. When Callan settled onto the rail, the horse's entire body language shifted from defensive alertness to something approaching curiosity. "He's closer today," Neville observed. "He's testing, seeing if I'll change my behavior now that he's shown interest." Callan kept his movements minimal, deliberate. "The worst thing I could do right now is interpret this as permission to push further." But privately, Callan was growing more concerned about that limp. Yesterday it had been barely noticeable. Today, Bronson was definitely shifting weight off that leg. Whatever injury he was carrying wasn't improving with rest. An hour later, as Callan climbed down from the fence, Bronson did something that made both men freeze. He walked directly to where Callan had been sitting and lowered his head to sniff the wooden rail. "Jesus," Neville breathed. "He's actually investigating you." Callan felt a mixture of hope and worry. The horse's willingness to explore was encouraging, but the way he moved to the fence told a more complex story. Bronson wasn't just curious about Callan's scent. He was trying to understand something about this human who didn't behave like the others. "That's progress," Callan said quietly. "But we're still a long way from trust." As if responding to his words, Bronson lifted his head and looked directly at Callan for the first time. The intelligence in those dark eyes was unmistakable, but so was something else. A wariness so deep it seemed to go beyond individual experience. This horse wasn't just afraid of being hurt again. He was afraid of hoping that things could be different. And that, Callan realized, was going to be the hardest barrier to overcome. Because hope, for an animal that had been repeatedly betrayed, wasn't a gift. It was a vulnerability that had been used against him before. By the fourth day, Bronson was waiting at the fence when Callan arrived. Not close enough to touch, but close enough that Callan could see the details he'd been missing from a distance. The round scar above the horse's shoulder wasn't alone. There were others, smaller ones, in a pattern that made Callan's stomach turn. "I want to have a vet look at him," Callan told Neville over breakfast. "For what? He looks healthy enough. That limp is getting worse, not better, and I want a professional opinion on those scars." Callan set down his coffee cup. "I think we're dealing with something more serious than rough training. Doctor?" Sarah Chen arrived that afternoon, a compact woman in her 40s who'd been treating ranch animals in the area for 15 years. She approached the corral with the calm confidence of someone who'd seen every kind of horse injury imaginable. "What's your concern?" she asked, studying Bronson from outside the fence. "Multiple old injuries, possible systematic abuse, and he's favoring that left rear leg more each day." Dr. Chen watched Bronson move around the corral, her expression growing troubled. Those scars on his shoulder and neck, they're too uniform to be accidental. And see how he holds his head slightly tilted? That suggests old trauma to the ear, or jaw. What kind of trauma? Hard to say without a closer examination. But the pattern suggests deliberate infliction. She pulled out a small telescope and focused on Bronson's legs. That limp is definitely neurological. See how he's not just favoring the leg, but compensating with his entire gait? That's nerve damage. Callan felt his suspicions crystallizing into certainty. Could this be from a fighting operation? Dr. Chen lowered the telescope and looked at him sharply. What makes you ask that? The strategic thinking, the defensive positioning, the specific types of scars. I've seen one case before, years ago. Callan paused. Horse that had been used as a bait animal for training fighting dogs. That would explain everything I'm seeing. Dr. Chen's voice carried professional disgust. The burns, the precise placement of injuries, the psychological damage. Someone used this animal for target practice. Can you confirm it? I'd need to examine him up close. But from what I can observe, yes, I'd say that's exactly what happened to him. She studied Bronson with new understanding. The question is, who was running the operation, and why this horse survived when most don't? That evening, Callan called the auction house in El Paso. The conversation was brief but illuminating. Burke had sold 3 horses that day, all marked as difficult to handle. The auction manager remembered him being nervous, rushed, like someone eager to get rid of evidence. Did he mention why he was selling? Said he was getting out of the horse business, moving to Mexico for family reasons, paid in cash, left immediately after the sale. After hanging up, Callan sat on his porch staring at the corral where Bronson stood silhouetted against the evening sky. The pieces were falling into place, but they painted a picture darker than he'd imagined. This horse hadn't just survived abuse. He'd survived something that was designed to break his spirit completely. And somehow, impossibly, that spirit was still intact enough to begin trusting again. The question was whether Callan was strong enough to prove that not all humans were predators, or whether 40 years of experience had taught him nothing about earning the trust of something that had every reason to remain wild. On the 7th day, Callan decided to test the boundaries of their fragile trust. He brought a single apple in his jacket pocket, nothing more. No rope, no halter, no equipment that might trigger defensive instincts. Just an offering that showed peaceful intent. Bronson was waiting at his usual spot near the fence. But something was different. His ears were forward, alert, but not alarmed. When Callan settled onto the rail, the horse took 2 deliberate steps closer than he'd ever come before. That's it, buddy, Callan murmured, keeping his voice low and steady. You're starting to figure out I'm not like the others. Slowly, deliberately, Callan reached into his pocket and pulled out the apple. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Bronson's entire body went rigid, his ears pinned flat against his skull. In a heartbeat, the intelligent, curious animal vanished, replaced by something wild and terrified. The horse spun away so violently he nearly fell, his injured leg buckling under the sudden movement. He scrambled to the far corner of the corral, pressing his hindquarters against the fence, his eyes rolling white with panic. Easy, easy, Callan said. But the damage was done. Bronson was no longer seeing him. He was seeing someone else, somewhere else, reliving something that had taught him food meant pain. Callan immediately put the apple on the ground and backed away from the fence. I'm not him, he said quietly. Whoever hurt you, I'm not him. But Bronson remained pressed against the far fence, trembling, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. For 20 minutes, he stayed frozen in that defensive position, while Callan sat motionless on the rail, cursing himself for pushing too hard too fast. Neville appeared from the house, drawn by the commotion. What happened? I made a mistake, Callan said without taking his eyes off Bronson. Tried to offer him food before he was ready for it. It's just an apple. No, it's not. To him, it's a weapon. Callan's voice was tight with controlled anger, not at Bronson, but at whoever had conditioned this response. Someone used food to lure him into vulnerable positions, then hurt him when he trusted enough to approach. Jesus. Look at him. He's not just afraid of the apple. He's afraid of wanting it. Callan watched Bronson's sides heaving with stress. That's the cruelest thing you can do to an animal. Teach him that his natural instincts are traps. It took another hour before Bronson began to relax, and even then, he remained at maximum distance from where Callan sat. The careful progress of a week had been shattered in seconds by a simple gesture of kindness. "So what now?" Neville asked. "Now I learn from my mistake." Callan climbed down from the fence, leaving the apple where he'd dropped it. "And I proved to him that I can be wrong without being dangerous." But as he walked away, Callan caught sight of something that made his chest tighten. Bronson was looking at that apple with unmistakable longing, his nostrils flaring as he caught the scent. The horse wanted it desperately, but his learned fear was stronger than his natural desire. That night, Callan lay awake thinking about what he'd witnessed. Burke hadn't just physically abused this animal. He'd corrupted the horse's basic instincts, turning every natural behavior into a potential source of pain. Hunger became dangerous. Curiosity became a liability. Trust became the enemy. The question wasn't whether Bronson could be tamed. The question was whether it was even fair to try. 3 days passed before Bronson would come within 20 feet of the fence again. The apple remained where Callan had dropped it, slowly browning in the Texas sun, a reminder of how easily trust could be shattered. Each morning, Callan resumed his patient vigil, but the horse's earlier curiosity had been replaced by renewed wariness. On the 4th day, Dr. Chen returned with a portable digital X-ray unit. "If we're going to help this animal, I need to see the extent of the damage to that leg." The examination had to be conducted from outside the corral, with Bronson pressed against the far fence, but the images that appeared on Dr. Chen's tablet painted a stark picture. The left rear leg showed multiple fracture sites that had healed improperly, creating a complex web of scar tissue around damaged nerves. "This is worse than I thought," Dr. Chen said, pointing to the screen. "See these stress fractures along the cannon bone, and this displacement in the fetlock joint? This wasn't one injury. This was systematic damage over time." Callan studied the images, his jaw tightening. "What's the prognosis?" "For survival, good. He's adapted remarkably well. For function," Dr. Chen shook her head. "He'll never carry significant weight. Light riding maybe, but nothing more demanding than a gentle trail ride. The nerve damage means he'll always have limited feeling in that leg." Neville, who had been listening in silence, finally spoke up. "So you're telling me I paid good money for a horse that can't work?" "You paid for a survivor," Callan said quietly. "That's worth something." "Worth what?" "I can't use him for ranch work, can't breed him with that temperament, can't even get him gentle enough to pet." Neville's frustration boiled over. "I've got bills to pay." "Callan, sentiment doesn't feed cattle or fix fences." Dr. Chen packed her equipment with obvious discomfort. "There are sanctuaries that specialize in traumatized horses, places where an animal like this could live out his days without pressure to perform. Sanctuaries don't pay me back what I invested." After Dr. Chen left, Callan stood alone at the corral watching Bronson maintain his defensive distance. The horse's intelligence was still evident in every movement, every calculated positioning. But now Callan understood the full scope of what they were dealing with. Even if Bronson learned to trust again, even if the psychological damage could be healed, the physical limitations would remain forever. "You know what the worst part is?" Neville said, joining him at the fence. "I actually like the horse. He's got spirit, intelligence. Under different circumstances, he could have been something special. He is something special, just not in the way you wanted. That's easy for you to say. You're not the one facing financial loss." Callan turned to face Neville directly. "What if I bought him from you? With what money? You're retired. I've got savings. Enough to cover what you paid. Maybe a little more." The words came out before Callan had fully processed the thought, but once spoken, they felt right. "Give him to someone who isn't looking for profit." Neville stared at him. "You'd do that? Buy a horse you can never really ride?" Callan looked back at Bronson, who was watching their conversation with obvious interest, despite his distance. Sometimes the best thing you can do for a survivor is just let him survive, on his own terms. But even as he made the offer, Callan wondered if he was being naive. Could he really help this horse heal? Or was he just prolonging both their suffering? And if Bronson never learned to trust completely, would Callan be able to live with the knowledge that he'd failed where success mattered most? The paperwork took less than an hour. Callan's check cleared the amount Neville had paid at auction, plus enough extra to cover the veterinary expenses. By noon, Bronson officially belonged to a man who had no intention of breaking him for profit. "I still think you're making a mistake," Neville said, as they watched Bronson from the porch. That horse may never come around completely. Maybe not. But that's his choice to make, not mine. And if he doesn't? If you spend months or years and he still won't let you near him? Callan considered this carefully. Then I'll know I gave him something Burke never did. The right to say no. Within a week, Callan had arranged to move Bronson to a small property he'd been renting on the outskirts of town. 5 acres of pasture with a simple shelter. Enough space for a horse to feel free without being truly wild. The transport went better than expected, as if Bronson understood that this change meant distance from whatever memories haunted the Hartman ranch. When Callan opened the trailer gate and stepped back, giving Bronson room to explore on his own terms, the horse emerged cautiously but without panic. For the first time since they'd met, Bronson looked almost relaxed. Over the following weeks, Callan established a new routine. Morning visits to check water and feed, always from outside the fence. No pressure, no expectations, just consistent presence. Slowly, gradually, Bronson began to acknowledge that presence without fear. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning in October. Callan arrived to find Bronson standing near the gate, not pressed against the far fence as usual. When Callan approached with the feed bucket, the horse didn't retreat. Instead, he watched with obvious curiosity as Callan poured grain into the trough. "Morning, buddy," Callan said quietly, setting the bucket down just inside the gate. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Bronson's ears flicked forward at the sound of his voice. Then, incredibly, the horse took a single step toward the trough while Callan was still standing there. It was the smallest possible gesture, barely noticeable to anyone who hadn't spent months learning to read Bronson's subtle communications. But to Callan, it was everything. For the first time, the horse had chosen proximity to a human over safety through distance. "That's it," Callan breathed. "That's what I've been waiting for." He stayed motionless while Bronson approached the feed, noting how the horse kept one eye on him throughout the meal, not with fear or suspicion, but with something approaching acceptance, as if he was finally beginning to believe that this human might be different from all the others. When Bronson finished eating, he didn't immediately retreat to safety. Instead, he stood there looking directly at Callan with an expression that seemed almost questioning. "What is it, boy? What are you trying to tell me?" The answer came when Bronson took another step closer, then another, until only the fence separated them. Close enough that Callan could see the individual scars, the healed wounds, the evidence of everything this remarkable animal had survived. But more importantly, he could see something new in those dark eyes, something that made 3 months of patient waiting worthwhile. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of hope. 3 months later, on a crisp December morning, Callan arrived at the pasture to find Bronson waiting by the gate, not hiding, not defensive, but simply there, as if he'd been expecting company. "Good morning, boy," Callan said, carrying the feed bucket and a soft brush he'd brought every day but never used. "Ready for breakfast?" Bronson nickered softly, the first vocal communication he'd ever offered. The sound sent a thrill through Callan's chest, not because it meant the horse was broken, but because it meant he was healing. As Callan poured the grain, Bronson approached without hesitation, his injured leg bearing weight more confidently than it had in weeks. Dr. Chen's pain management protocol was working, but more than that, the absence of stress was allowing the horse's body to find its natural balance. "You know what, buddy? I think today might be different." Callan reached slowly into his pocket and pulled out a single apple, the same offering that had triggered panic months earlier. Bronson's ears flicked back momentarily, an echo of old fear, but he didn't retreat. Instead, he studied Callan's face with intelligent eyes, as if trying to determine intent. "It's just an apple," Callan said softly, holding it flat on his palm. "No tricks, no traps, just a gift from one friend to another." The horse approached carefully, each step a conscious decision to trust. When he was close enough, Bronson stretched his neck forward and delicately lifted the apple from Callan's hand, his soft lips barely brushing the weathered palm. But he didn't stop there. After finishing the apple, Bronson moved closer still, until his massive head was only inches from Callan's chest. Then, in a gesture that spoke of complete trust, he lowered his head and rested his forehead against Callan's shoulder. The contact lasted only a few seconds, but it said everything that months of training never could. This wasn't submission or defeat. This was a wild creature choosing to share space with a human because that human had proven worthy of trust. "There you go," Callan whispered, fighting back unexpected tears. "Nobody said you had to be tamed, did they? You just needed someone to prove that trust doesn't always lead to pain. Over the following hour, Callan gently brushed Bronson's coat while the horse stood relaxed and alert. When he finished, Bronson didn't move away. Instead, he turned and looked at Callan with unmistakable affection, then walked calmly to the center of his pasture and began grazing. Bronson would never be a typical ranch horse, but he was something far more precious, a survivor who'd learned to hope again. Success wasn't measured by submission, but by his choice to trust over survival instinct. Nobody had tamed the wild horse. They'd simply given him permission to choose civilization on his own terms. That evening, Callan sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in shades of gold and crimson. Tomorrow, he'd return to Bronson's pasture, not to train or tame or break, but simply to visit a friend who'd taught him that sometimes the greatest victory was knowing when not to fight. In the end, that was the only kind of taming that ever truly mattered. Some stories stay with us long after they end, reminding us that the most powerful victories come through patience and understanding. If this tale touched something in you, there's another story waiting on your screen about an unlikely friendship that defied all expectations. Consider subscribing to support more narratives like this one. Your encouragement helps us bring these meaningful stories to life.